was doing emergency coverage at Mendota Mental Health Institute. I was on the ward, and one of the nurses said, "Have you met Ed Gein?" I said, "No, I haven't." But she said, "Well, let me introduce you." I knew that he had murdered 2 people in this tiny town in the middle of Wisconsin. Then I learned all the other things that he had done. Make lampshades out of human skin, take skulls and make soup bowls out of them, and had a tremendous number of things that he did that were kind of macabre.
Well, what parts would you take, Paul? The head and the sexual organ.
Yeah,
He knew that they had made a movie. The comparison between the 2 of them was so right on that it was very, very scary. But I was interested. I've always been curious. That's been my downfall.
You got all the girls? What's crime like? Oh.
that was in. Oh, that one,
You know, over the years when these movies would come out about Ed Gein, I never was really interested because we live the fact. It's a terrible thing for Ed Gein. It's a terrible thing for the people involved, and it was a terrible thing for the whole community of Plainfield. Why Ed Gein done what he done, I don't know. It's just too bad that the whole thing happened. Don't know what to call him. I don't know if he was deranged or if he was insane. I'm not proud to connect my dad with Ed Gein, but I'm proud of the way he handled the case and that things were handled the way they were handled.
I once made a movie, rather tongue-in-cheek, called Psycho. A lot of people looked at this thing and said, what a dreadful thing to do, how awful, and so forth. But of course it was, to me, it had great elements of the cinema in it.
Psycho originally appealed to one of Hitchcock's assistants who placed the novel in front of Hitchcock and said, let's do this next, boss.
We all enjoy, shall we say, putting our toe in the cold water of fear.
Hitchcock had just made North by Northwest. And what came after this was The Birds.
Psycho is a kind of outlier for Hitchcock in many ways. First of all, of course, it's much more of a horror film compared to the suspense that he typically is associated with.
Possibly what drew Hitchcock to Psycho was the idea that this was an American small-town horror story.
I think he was so attracted to this material in general because he was interested in what makes a character tick and how we can understand a character via that character's psychology.
name of Ed Gein means return of memories, memories that many have been trying to forget.
Hitchcock attempted to get financing through his studio for this, and the studio pushed it away, rejected it, and said, you can't make this film. This is not what we want. And so what Hitchcock did was enforce the terms of his contract, which gave him creative control over even big questions like, okay, what film are we doing next?
You have to remember that this process of frightening is done by means of a given medium, the medium of pure cinema.
Hitchcock used his TV crew, not his film crew, to make this. And that's part of the reason why the film's in black and white, when his previous films had been in color. He was using the tools that his TV crew knew best to make this film.
That's one really interesting thing about Psycho. Of course, at that time, black and white is still a little bit more associated with realism than color film, right? Because color has this long history of being used as something of fantasy. Think about The Wizard of Oz. When Dorothy goes to Oz, all of a sudden everything's in color. We still kind of had those associations with black and white versus color by 1960. We don't think of Psycho as like a realistic kind of movie, but the use of that particular kind of film stock actually places it much more in the realm of lived experience and of the world.
The assembly of pieces of film to create fright is the essential part of my job, just as much as a painter would, by putting certain colors together, create evil on canvas.
Well, I run the office and tend the cabins and grounds and do little errands for my mother.
I think the first time I saw Psycho, I was a teenager. I think I was about 15, and it scared the living daylights out of me. I was absolutely terrified. I mean, it was just absolute terror. The movie signals something about this interest in violence, this interest in the kind of perversions underneath the placid surface.
Sometimes when she talks to me like that, I feel I'd like to go up there.
This is a shot that is so famous, and many people turn to this shot when they're talking about Psycho. And that's because this is a really, really great low angle here where we see Norman Bates. Something's very, very wrong. Something's wrong in Norman's psychology. All is not what it seems. And this is the scene where Norman says something equivalent to a boy's best friend is his mother. One of the things that we can see as Hitchcock's career progresses is that he really uses a lot of these kind of psychoanalytic approaches and approaches to character psychology, and that was part of what made it such a raging success. Psycho was released just over 2 years after Ed Gein's crimes were discovered.
I've suggested that Psycho be seen from the beginning. In fact, this is more than a suggestion. It is required.
This was the very first time that audiences were not allowed to enter the film after the movie had started. So if you wanted to buy a ticket and go see Psycho, you had to get there when it started because Hitchcock didn't want anybody to give away the twist.
No one, but no one, will be admitted to the theater after the start of each performance of Psycho.
Audiences loved the film. It was amazingly popular, but reviewers less so. And in many of the reviews, Hitchcock was getting a lot of credit for like, and wow, Hitchcock had the courage to kill off the main character so early.
This film had a horrible scene at the beginning of a girl being murdered in the shower.
Yeah.
Well, I deliberately made that pretty rough. But as the film developed, I put less and less physical horror into it. I was transferring it from film into their mind. So towards the end, I had no violence at all. But the audience by this time was screaming in agony.
Psycho's a lot more raw than earlier Hitchcock films. And I don't want to make it sound that Hitchcock wasn't interested in psychology before, but here in Psycho, we have it linked up with it actually being a real story, and that makes it really, really scary. It's in the title. It's about somebody being a psychotic, and that is really different from just saying, this monster's outlandish. This monster can never happen. Here, we have a monster who is defined by the inner workings of his brain. And that's what I think makes it such a different horror film.
I grew up in the 1950s, baby boomer, and going to the movies all the time. And all the monsters in movies back then were alien in some way. What Hitchcock did with Psycho was he created the first, all-American cinematic monster. And it was, of course, directly inspired by Gein.
I was doing emergency coverage at Mendota Mental Health Institute. I was on the ward, and one of the nurses said, "Have you met Ed Gein?" I said, "No, I haven't." But she said, "Well, let me introduce you." I was interested. I've always been curious. That's been my downfall. I saw the movie Psycho when I was in high school. And I was terrified by it. I remember I was with a girlfriend of mine. We had gone to see the movie. When we left the movie, we walked down the middle of the street because we weren't going to be near anybody who could do anything to us. When you saw the rocker, the rocking chair, and you saw the mother, and you saw him, you could see that Ed Gein was the prototype for the character. The first meeting of him, he was in what we called the day room, and I went up to talk to him.
What would you do with the sexual part?
That was in.
One was painted, they said.
Oh, that one, when they died, I just put the paint over it. Is there anything like,
We would talk about the weather. We would talk about some of the things he remembered about his life. He was aware that he had been very much written about and talked about.
Nice man, just like anybody else. He seems to be harmless fella,
I knew his dad more than 40 years ago was when he used to haul potatoes in town.
He was very soft-spoken.
My sister-in-law, she's in a home now. She said, "Did you know Eddie Gein's killed Mrs. Wharton?"
I'm afraid that if people found out about that, there might be quite an uprising.
He knew that they had made a movie in which he was the prototype for the character.
Oh, we have 12 vacancies. 12 cabins, 12 vacancies.
Ed Gein was Norman Bates. Norman Bates was Ed Gein. Mild-mannered, attractive, nice to people around him. But very much hidden were all of the crazy things that he did. some people had made movies or some characters after him, but that didn't make him any better. He's just very bland about everything. He never seemed to show much emotion. But that's so common in serial murderers. But he didn't like to talk about his crimes. He didn't want to glorify it. Psycho was such a powerful movie. He had so many people after him. He was hounded by everybody.
So there's a bunch of photographers from the newspapers want to take your picture. You want to take your picture?
No, it's not yet. He will get taken straight off.
There will be an auction here Palm Sunday, but this house and the personal belongings of Ed Gein will be conspicuously absent. Call it an act of God or whatever you will. The main attraction will be missing, reduced to a mass of rubble by a mysterious fire.
All we knew is that that one morning we got up and Eddie Gein's house had burnt down.
The farm where Ed Gein lived and where much of the grisly evidence has been found has been leveled. It burned down one night, no one knows why, but since then the ground has been bulldozed over and trees planted there, trying apparently to wipe out every vestige of the grisly tragedy.
We had heard that it took a long time for the fire department to get there. I'm sure it was arson, and I think there was proof of that, but everybody was glad. We'd heard they were going to make a museum out of it, and that would be the last thing that the community needed. After it burnt, everybody was glad that it had burnt rather than having a museum of a sick man's home.
The people of Plainfield and the area hope that 10 years... Oh, stop. Stop a minute. But a period of 10 years isn't enough for people to forget. And the farmers and people of Plainfield hope they won't have to return to the agony, the notoriety that accompanied the Ed Gein case just 10 years ago.
He was found incompetent for many years, and I think the reason is because what he did was just so outrageous. It was so bizarre that the psychiatrist that evaluated him, as well as the judge, probably said, I just don't know. Let's just wait and see what we have. Eventually, he was found competent to proceed because he always was competent.
Oh, he looked somewhat healthier. He was seemed rather dark and gaunt personage 10 years ago. He seems more like a middle-aged businessman at this time.
Ed Gein had all kinds of fantasies about traveling to Europe.
This is the courtroom where Ed Gein was. Hey, Wes.
Nice to see you.
This would have been whereabouts Ed Gein stood when he was on trial. Pretty much think it's identical to what it was back then from the photos I've seen.
Judge Robert Gomar presided over Gein's 1968 trial. Gein was found insane.
When he first appeared before me, I got the impression somewhat of a puppy. He's a small, neat-looking man, and he stood there with a kind of a ingratiating little smile on his face. It was obvious he wanted to make a good impression on the judge, and if he'd had a tail to wiggle, I'm sure the puppy description would apply to him.
I had contacted Judge Robert Gomar and was invited to his home. He did have this kind of Colonel Sanders aura about him. He'd kind of basked, I think, a little in his connection to the Gein case, because it was obviously kind of the highlight of his judicial career. And he had taken advantage of his position in the case to write a book about Gein. One thing he did do in the book was reproduce crime scene photographs of Bernice Worden's violated corpse hanging from the rafters, disemboweled, very shocking photographs, which had incurred the anger and the resentment of the people of Plainfield because they felt those photographs should never have been publicized.
He took parts of the people home with him. He took the skin of women particularly. He decorated furniture with it. He made many other items out of it.
At that time, I don't know if it still holds, but Wisconsin had what they call these bifurcated or split trials. First, Gein would be tried for the murder of Bernice Worden. Then he would immediately have another trial in which his mental competence would be determined.
My folks never talked about the trial. I don't think that they thought we needed to know these horrific details of the crime. We knew that we thought that my dad was having heart problems. My dad would get such bad pains, and I hated to see that. I'd say, "Dad, what's the matter? What's the matter?" "Oh, nothing, I just got indigestion," he'd say. But then one night it was just a massive heart attack, and that was it. He had just turned 43 years old.
One of his relatives said that this sheriff was actually the last victim of Ed Gein because he was so disturbed by what he'd seen and so disturbed by what Ed Gein's actions did to him personally. Ed Gein may as well have killed him.
Gein was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Bernice Worden. Immediately, there was a second part of the trial, and he was declared mentally incompetent and returned to the mental institution. And so, in effect, Gein was convicted and acquitted at the same time.
The issue is his mental state at the time of the crime. In this case, you could argue that he has a mental disorder, but that's not all with respect to meeting the legal standard.
Would you enjoy it while you were doing it?
That's the worst part of it. I really didn't then. I knew better in life, restless.
You need a defect of reason. And that usually means your thinking is delusional. God told me to do it, Martians are controlling my mind, that type of thing. Well, Gein knew what he was doing. He knew very well what he was doing.
When you dig these graves up, you were kind of in a haze, too, is that it?
That's what I could do, just how you look at it.
And then one time you said you were trying to realize what you were doing, and you covered her up without taking anything.
That's right.
When I look at this from a distance, I don't see any basis for incompetency or legal insanity. Disturbance, yes. Legal insanity, based on what? He knew what he was doing, and he knew what he was doing was wrong. That's the standard.
Back in 1962, the crime scene investigators returned all the body parts from Ed Gein's house, and they put them in a mass grave, which would include Mary Hogan's head. So they're all in that one grave. So this is the spot of the mass grave where all the body parts are. His skin suit, all the mass. Mary Hogan's head is probably here. So now we're trying to uncover it. Okay, this is it. We found it. It says this is dedicated to the unknown that are buried here.
Gein admitted to digging up 9 to 11 bodies, most from this Plainfield cemetery. But to this day, no one is sure how many graves may actually be empty.